Hi, it's me, Brodie McLeod, making another one of my Wastecast videos, so thank you very much for watching. Hope you find it interesting and hope everybody is keeping warm this winter, and I hope you find the thematic implications of a book I was once given. It's probably one of my favourite books. It doesn't matter who gave it to me, it's irrelevant, and it's not in any way any kind of sort of reference or denotation, demarcation, or anything to do with, in the nicest possible way, the person who gave me the book, or anything to do with, as it is, fireworks night, enlightenment in any kind of sardonic or kind of absurdist context. It's just content which I thought about what I could make a video about. Sometimes I'm stuck with themes, and I think that sort of philosophy and the misappropriated persecution of Enlightenment thinkers and people who were kind of preeminent social revolutionaries of a time in history is quite sort of relevant to today's cultural malaise and shift in ideological infractions and diversification of thematic interpretations of what we call God. And I think there are answers in philosophy. And if you read the book, you'll see what I mean. So anyway, here's a deep research paper on that book, which I'll read to you. So, critical reaffirmation, a dialectical analysis of In Defence of the Enlightenment. It's a book that came out in 2009, and it serves not merely as a historical survey, but as a polemical and urgent political statement. It attempts to salvage the core humanist values of the Enlightenment from its historical misapplications and its harshest critics, primarily those associated with postmodernism and the counter-Enlightenment. The central thesis posits that failures attributed to the 18th century movement, things like totalitarianism, scientism, and political fanaticism, are not authentic expressions of the Enlightenment's spirit, but they're more malignant distortions of its core principles. So the book's narrative consensus and thematic conclusions centre on defining the Enlightenment as a continuous self-critical methodology necessary for modern democratic health. So the Enlightenment Project Reclaimed, a new synthesis, is rooted in a kind of anti-totalitarian imperative, establishing a clear separation between the authentic values of the movement and the ideological abuses perpetrated in its name. The historical context and anti-totalitarian imperative. The author's lived experience provides the moral urgency for the defence. Having spent the first 24 years of his life in communist Bulgaria, he was intimately familiar with corrupting, devastating, and often lethal effects of utopian dictatorship. This direct knowledge led him to conclude that the most critical lessons of the 20th century must be drawn from extreme utopian dictatorships, epitomised by the USSR and also Hitler's Germany. This historical trauma under communism functions as a dialectical catalyst for the book's argument, because totalitarian regimes characterised by political millenarianism, utopian certainty, and scientism, it's compelled to define an authentic Enlightenment that actively rejects these elements. So the structure of his argument is explicitly methodological. The book begins by establishing the project, like the authentic core, before dedicating the subsequent chapter to into rejections and distortions. It's not merely a structural choice, but a political prescription, arguing that the past lessons derived from totalitarianism must be related directly to contemporary issues such as disinformation and state-sponsored torture and the inner enemies of democracy. So sort of separating spirit from its illegitimate heirs. Defining authentic spirit, the Kantian legacy, self-limitation. So he defines the central act of the Enlightenment as a shift in the source of knowledge from external authority, such as the deity, the Bible, or the church, to disciplined, free exercise of human reason. This defence sort of hinges on a nuanced interpretation of reason, is that it must be self-limiting. It identifies Immanuel Kant, the author of the seminal essay What is Enlightenment, and David Hume as central figures precisely because they were thinkers looking for the limits of reason. This focus on internal sort of critique is presented as the essential firewall against the Enlightenment collapsing into an unchecked authority it originally sought to replace. The core philosophical thesis of the book is that fidelity to the Enlightenment maintained through constant self-scrutiny. As summarised in a crucial passage, it says, and quote, "It is by criticising the Enlightenment that we remain faithful to it." This assertion semantically shifts the Enlightenment from a static set of historical dogmas to a permanent anti-authoritarian methodology by defining fidelity through perpetual critique. So the author seeks to inoculate the movement against the charge that its own principles inevitably lead to excesses. Distortions, unmasking the inner enemies of the Enlightenment. So the second major pillar of the narrative involves systematically identifying and categorising the ways the original Enlightenment project was corrupted, thereby laying the groundwork for modern political pathologies, the corruption of utopianism and political millenarianism. Totalitarianism for the author is fundamentally a failure of radical utopianism. It's characterised by radical utopian dimension, holding out the disastrous promise of paradise on earth and salvation for all. This desire for ultimate perfection, often labelled as political millenarianism, is inherently dangerous because it justifies any means necessary to achieve the predeterminate end. It recognises that the belief in automatic, inevitable progress espoused by some Enlightenment thinkers was a dangerous philosophical error. As he quotes it, a transportation of the Christian doctrine by ways of the providence into profane space. By linking utopian politics back to religious millenarianism, he places the totalitarian project outside of the tradition of rational critique, defining it instead as a form of secular faith rooted in destructive certainties. Critically, this utopian drive often collapses into what is characterised as a stifling obsession with efficiency. This marks a dangerous transition from imagining a perfect alternative social order like a utopia, or organising existing processes as if the perfect order already existed, or was already established in efficiency, justifying organisational control in the name of technical necessity, if that makes sense. The ethical alternative championed is democratic Mellorism, emphasising continuous incremental improvement rather than revolutionary rupture. The peril of scientism and instrumental rationalisation. Critical element of the defence is the rigorous separation of genuine enlightenment and inquiry from scientism. While Enlightenment thinkers embrace scientific inquiry, the author argues that scientism, the belief that scientific method alone is the source of all knowledge and the appropriate guide for all human affairs, was misappropriated by political regimes. This distinction is highlighted by comparing his view with that of Karl Popper, whereas Popper saw the scientific method with its emphasis on scepticism and falsification as an intellectual check against totalitarian ideology. So he suggests that the ideology of scientism itself is integral to the totalitarian project. He says that the danger of unchecked rationalisation is the reductionist caricature of reason, quoting, desiccating and too dry, which eliminates the place for arts, for myth, which is a different kind of knowledge of the world. It gets a bit confusing if you haven't read the book, but yeah, the author's suspicious of any system, including scientific ideology, that promises absolute solutions or certainty when applied to human affairs. The ideological certainty of scientism grants political technocrats the unchallengeable authority previously held by religious figures, allowing political power to utilise the prestige of scientific organisation to justify non-democratic control and comprehensive social engineering, refuting cultural chauvinism and postmodern relativism. So in addressing the universalist claims of enlightenment, the author rejects the standard diffusionist view that the movement was an exclusively European phenomenon and subsequently spread around the globe. He argues that his diffusionist paradigm often masks cultural chauvinism. Simultaneously, the book serves as a robust response to postmodern critique, which argues that universal values are merely a covert justification for the exploration of non-European world. So he maintains that to abandon the idea of universal principles entirely is to surrender the necessary moral and intellectual tools required to address the global moral crises. Things like disinformation, state torture, and moralism. The recognition of shared universal values remains paramount for maintaining judgment in a globalised world. So the core pillars of the humanist enlightenment and the thematic deconstruction of those. The positive defence rests on reaffirming what he sees as the 5 core principles of enlightenment. So the project, autonomy, secularism, truth, humanity, and universality. These principles are reinterpreted to incorporate the lessons learned from the failures of the 20th century. The primacy of autonomy and the necessity of interdependence. So autonomy, or individual freedom as you might want to call it, is presented not as a radical isolated state but as a conditioned achievement. He asserts that true autonomy must arise out of a sense of actual interdependence. He fundamentally rejects the notion of the individual existing in a pure state of nature, arguing instead for the necessity of social scaffolding. Here's a quote from the book there: "Every human being needs a set of norms and rules, traditions and customs transmitted from the older to the younger. Without those norms, the individual would never achieve the fullness of his humanity, but would be reduced to the condition of the wild child, condemned to anomie and other words, to the absence of all law and order, an absence that can create severe disturbances." By emphasising the necessary social foundation for individual development, he incorporates a key concern of counter-enlightenment, so the danger of social dissolution, thereby protecting autonomy from the destructive forces of anomie and revolutionary rupture. This approach kind of validates the idea people need security and comfort just as much as they need freedom of truth. So secularism, truth, and the continuous struggle. Secularism is defended as the crucial emancipatory value that allows us to be free and exercise critical investigation unbound from the predetermined religious authority. The principle of truth, crucial in an era plagued by disinformation and globalization, demands the forthright, accurate, and meaningfully organized presentation of knowledge. The ultimate ethical imperative derived from these principles is one of perpetual critical vigilance, shifting the focus from fighting external evil to fighting ideological arrogance. This redefinition of the moral struggle is reflected in his philosophical statement on the fight against certainty, which transforms the pursuit of truth into an epistemology based on humility and continuous revision, rendering the Enlightenment inherently anti-fanatical. So like right now, if there's, flag shaggers or their opposites, I think this might be a good book for both, sets of British sort of righteously indignated people to consider. So deconstructing philosophical quotes and their dialectical implications. The core arguments of the book are distilled in several key passages that function as a response to historical and contemporary critics. So analysing these quotes reveals the precise nature of his dialectical strategy, which is to reconcile the critical function of reason with the complexity of human reality. Deconstruction 1, Reason, Myth and the Dangers of Reduction. So he directly addresses the romantic and counter-enlightenment critique that rationalism strips the world of meaning and beauty. So that it's sort of like using, science and democracy and, things like that to govern our internal domestic processes rather than doctrines of religious ideology, sort of. A quote here says, "To say that reason is only desiccating and too dry is a dangerous caricature. No less dangerous is to eliminate the place for art, for myth, which is different kind of knowledge of the world. We have to be cautious about both dangers, both reductions." So the meaning and dialectical implication of that statement is a powerful defence of epistemological pluralism. He's insisting that reason must be limited and must respect non-instrumental forms of human knowledge, such as art and myth, which are vital for a deeper understanding of the world. He positions the true Enlightenment project as being aware of its own limits, rejecting the monism of extreme rationalism, sort of scientism, just as it rejects extreme feelings in romantic anti-rationalism. The recognition of both dangers, both reductions, is the basis for intellectual balance, securing enlightenment against the charge of inherent reductionism. Deconstruction 2, moral certainty and the anti-fanatical stance. The lessons of the 20th century totalitarianism informs redefinition of the moral antagonist. Another quote from the book: "We should not be simply fighting evil in the name of good, but struggling against the certainties of people who claim always to know where good and evil are to be found." So what he meant by that is that, it's trying to identify a deep political threat as an ideological certainty, and that's fanaticism. There's a lot of fanatics about at the moment. Absolute moral knowledge, the certainty of possessing the ultimate good, is what justifies violence. Every war that's ever been fought has been fought by people who were righteous. Righteousness is, condemned in a lot of, philosophical tropes and memes. It's persecution and means like torture has occurred when Lenin deployed such methods in the name of accelerating human progress. By promoting struggle against certainty, the author champions a continuous, modest and ethically humble political engagement, directly countering the need for absolute truth inherent in totalitarian millenarianism. Deconstruction 3, autonomy, anomie and the need for structure. Torodov defends the role of inherited structure in cultivating human freedom. Every human being needs a set of norms and rules, traditions and customs transmitted from the older to the younger. Without those norms, the individual would never achieve the fullness of his humanity, but would be reduced to the condition of the wild child, condemned to anomie, in other words, to the absence of all law and order, like an absence that can create disturbances. And what he meant by that, it was kind of a direct engagement with critics who warn against the revolutionary dissolution of tradition, Burkean conservatism, and sort of synthesises this concern by arguing that norms and traditions aren't obstacles to freedoms, but they're like the necessary precondition to achieving the fullness of humanity. So freedom's not a natural state, but a social, cultivated achievement. The passage uses the sociological concept of anomie to demonstrate the practical, political and psychological cost of radical, decontextualised individual freedom, which is what we're seeing at the moment, I think, across the UK over the last 6 months. Critical consensus evaluating the dialectical defence. The book's reception reflects on a central tension, whether the methodological separation of Enlightenment's spirit from its distortions is philosophically honest or merely polemical wish fulfilment. So the fundamental charge, John Gray's dissent. So British philosopher John Gray provided one of the most rigorous critiques, accusing him of practicing a form of Enlightenment fundamentalism. Gray argues that Todorov attempts to define a pure Enlightenment essence that is innocent of any complicity in modern error, which Gray dismisses as childish reasoning. Gray asserts that the Enlightenment, like all human traditions, must be seen to partake fully of human folly. Gray specifically criticises Todorov for historical sanitisation, claiming that he downplays the Judeo-Christian traditions that underpinned the early Enlightenment values, such as toleration. By those two guys, don't know who they are. This critique suggests that Todorov's project, while motivated by admirable humanist goals, prioritises polemical utility, defending core principles for contemporary use over and above a comprehensive historical genealogy that acknowledges the inherent complexity and contradictions of the movement. For Gray, a true defence would incorporate, not exclude, the potential for misuse. So there's a split on the scientific checks. So the work stands alongside that of classical anti-totalitarian theorists like Hannah Arendt, Isaiah Berlin and Karl Popper, with whom he shares much common ground in identifying the key features of totalitarianism. However, a major divergence exists concerning the role of science in protecting society from authoritarianism. So the idea of comparison and the significance of difference. So political millenarianism and the ideology of scientism, historical pseudoscience and the failure of open inquiry / critical method, critiques the political will to certainty inherent in ideological rationalisation. It's kind of a bit weird, the format. AI's got confused here. the role of science and reason. Reason must be self-limiting, recognising arts and myth. Scientism provides the means, the efficiency for utopian terror. The scientific method, falsification, is a primary check and antidote to dogmatism and tyranny. Highlights deep scepticism regarding the political application of instrumental reason, which he believes facilitates totalitarian control. That's a bit of a weird paragraph. Sorry about that. This disagreement is significant because it defines his ultimate critique of modern political power. It's fundamentally suspicious of instrumental rationalisation and argues that scientific ideology, when applied to society, is not a check against tyranny, but rather a sophisticated tool for justifying the unchallengeable political authority necessary for large-scale social engineering. So, make of that what you will. In conclusion, semantic legacy and thematic urgency. In Defence of the Enlightenment is a profound effort to reaffirm the Enlightenment's essential relevance by purifying its identity. The book's comprehensive narrative systematically addresses historical failures by establishing a methodological distinction between the core values and their subsequent distortions. The thematic core is the defence of a humanist, self-limiting enlightenment grounded by the indispensable principles of autonomy, secularism, truth, and universality. This self-limiting criterion provides the moral architecture necessary to resist the totalitarian impulse. The semantic conclusion of the book is that the Enlightenment is not a fixed historical period or a set of static doctrines, but a critical ethical attitude, continuous process of self-correction against the hydra heads of fanaticism, arbitrary authority, and the obscurantism that perpetually re-emerge from human nature. By framing fidelity as an act of perpetual critique, it is by criticising the Enlightenment that we remain faithful to it. He transcends the limitation of historical defence and establishes a framework for ongoing critical vigilance. Ultimately, it's a rejection of the utopian pursuit of historical perfection in favour of democratic meliorism. His work is a political prescription arguing that the enduring legacy of the Enlightenment amounts to the perpetual right to seek improvement and reform. Ironically, there is a party called Reform, and I don't think they're doing anything to seek improvement or perpetual rights for anybody. Ironically, but for those who do support them, read this book. Provided that this process is carried out with self-imposed limits and epistemic humility, rigorously opposing the fatal attraction of ideological certainty, the lasting contribution of the defence lies in its insistence that the greatest threat to modern democracy is the internal corruption of Enlightenment ideals, providing a necessary framework for resisting contemporary challenges ranging from global disinformation to unchecked technological dominance. It's 8:01. I'm going to go and have a cup of coffee and some breakfast. I hope everybody has a great night tonight and enjoys all of the festivities. I'm going to be sat in a psychiatric ward having a nightmare on my own, but lots of love to everybody. And whatever your side of the political sphere you vest your ideological reasoning, rationale, and sort of divine application of social conscience and conduct into whatever demographic you ideologically align yourself with, I think that you could probably find, the truth does lie somewhere in the middle, and that you do have given rational, imperative, and reflective ideological criticisms to your own beliefs, like I kind of have been doing in the last year or so. You will find that there is a lot to be gained from thinking things that may seem ulterior to your, secular or nationalist or, patriotic ideals. And if you've got the open mind to be able to contextualise that, then I think there's a lot to be gained. in the current climate from that book. You can get it on Amazon and probably loads of other places. Just Google it. It's a bit of a heavy read, it is quite taxing on the old neurons, but very much worthwhile. Anyway, have a good day and a good night, and lots of love.